Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is going to be my non-scripted, hopefully non-rambly and coherent review or chat about the first three novels that Meg Wolitzer wrote. For the last few years, I have been in the process of reading Meg Wolitzer's Backlist, and I've technically finished with this video. Technically finished her adult novels, that is. Meg Wolitzer's actually written a little bit of YA and middle grade, and I haven't read all of those, but I feel like for my purposes I'm really mostly interested in her adult output, and there's plenty of other authors whose backlists I want to get to. So this is my finish line right here. These three novels Wolitzer wrote in her 20s, and I have to admit they're not my favorite of her novels. I think that she had yet to find her stride. I'm glad she started with these because I guess, you know, everybody needs to start somewhere, and I'm sure they helped her become the author who ultimately wrote The Interestings and Surrender Dorothy, which I love, and also The Female Persuasion, her most recent. And there's good things to say about them, and criticisms, and I will do my best. Her first novel that she wrote when she was in college and got published shortly after, is called Sleepwalking. And I think that of the three, it actually sounds the most like her later works. Something to do with the interior monologues of the characters, and I guess because of the influence of Sylvia Plath in it, who later is another influence for her in her YA novel Beljar, which is one that I actually did read. This novel follows the character Claire, who is a dead girl. She and her two friends from Swarthmore are dead girls, and they each sort of idolize a female poet who died young, and Claire idolizes the fictional Lucy Asher, who had committed suicide, I guess in the late 70s, a few years before the novel opens. And Claire has her reasons for being sort of depressed and death-obsessed. It's a little bit, I guess, of an amalgamation of sort of teenage fantasies, but also some more unusual parts of her backstory that led to that. And she ends up getting into a relationship with a guy, Julian, for a little while, but she struggles with the fact that he's kind of trying to bring her more into the real world, I guess, and she's still very much in her Lucy Asher obsession. So her friends encourage her to maybe do some stalking from afar of Lucy's family, and so she ends up sort of taking that to the nth degree, and she lives with the parents for a little while, and I don't know, comes to more understandings about her life. I think I'm more amenable to Claire's journey now than I was when I read it a few weeks ago, so I guess that's a good thing. I think I respect the cadences of what she went through. Again, such an interior process, and this interior process felt a lot like Wolitzer's later works. But what really didn't work for me in Claire's story was her relationship with her boyfriend Julian, because it was very obvious to me that Julian was the type of person who only looked at her as someone to save. He wasn't actually interested in her genuinely as a person. And it was something that I kept on noticing, and I don't necessarily think that Wolitzer did. I'd be curious, I think she'd do it a lot differently if she wrote this novel now, when she's in her 60s, versus what she did then, in her 20s. I think the strongest part of the story, actually, is about Lucy's parents. They just seem like the most fleshed out characters in terms of their backstory and how they're dealing with their own grief and how that changes when Claire comes into their lives. And I think that's a very promising sign in and of itself, that in her 20s Meg Wolitzer was able to get into the heads of these older people. And I think that's something that continued to serve her well throughout the rest of her works. So it is a pretty quiet story in its way, somewhat dramatic, but it deals with I think the dramas of young teenage life and how we deal with the uncertainties of not knowing what's out there, and of trying to find our own voices. But Claire does have a little bit of an unusual backstory, so that she doesn't seem completely just goth. I mean, although she is pretty goth. But I do think Lucy Asher, in and of herself, is probably the weakest character. She sort of works better as something that influences everyone else, but when Wolitzer tried to get into her own head, then it did seem a little bit, I don't know, it seemed a little bit shallow, like she wasn't really sure what she was doing with who Lucy was. Lucy's much better as someone for everyone else to react to. But yeah, it was a great first start, and it sounded like Wolitzer, as I said, so I was happy. I feel like her second book in particular doesn't sound like her at all. It's a really shallow sort of depiction in Hidden Pictures, where she writes about a lesbian couple living in the 1980s. So I don't want to dismiss it outright, because the whole concept of the novel is that Laura is this depressed housewife who doesn't necessarily realize why until after she divorces her husband and sort of tumbles into some relationships with women, and it's like, oh, well, there's my, sexual attraction. But the thing that was so unusual, I would think, in the 80s is that Wolitzer wrote them as people who ultimately lived publicly. They had a son. I mean, Laura and her ex-husband had a son who lived with Laura and her partner. And they ended up moving to suburbia for the reasons that normal couples move out of the city into suburbia due to, commuting and job changes and what have you. And so I think Wolitzer really was trying to say, in the age where most people knew gay people as sort of fringe freaks on the edge of society, with AIDS and everything. AIDS didn't even come up in this story. She wanted to write them as a normal couple, and I think show that lesbians were normal, or maybe sort of work through that idea. And she had them encounter a couple of your sort of stereotypical bigots. I mean, I don't think they were necessarily unbelievable, but we don't really get into their heads beyond, the reaction of, whoa, weird, sort of stuff. So it was really sort of just a topical story, and I don't feel like the characters had that interior monologue and complexity that Wolitzer's best characters do. But I feel like, I was reading this in 2018, and I wonder if, it's one of those things that maybe doesn't age as well, because now we're more used to novels that realize that gay people are people. But I feel like it had to be more innovative when she wrote it in the 80s. And I'm especially intrigued that, AIDS did not make any sort of appearance, which of course affected gay men more than gay women. But it still was a big part of the entire community. But she really did write them as just people, and they obviously had to deal with what it meant to be gay in a society where everyone treated it like it was crazy pants. And Laura's partner in particular, was slightly more masculine presenting. But I really do feel like this was just about showing that maybe it's a little bit of foresight that gay people are going to end up wanting to be like everyone else in long-term, regular relationships. So yeah, I liked the characters. We also got a little bit into the son's head and the ex-husband's head. And, I think everything in the novel was, good enough. It was a decent enough story. And, again, probably innovative for its time, but it didn't have that extra spark. And finally, I just recently finished Wolitzer's third novel for adults called This Is Your Life, which was her first novel that was adapted into a movie back in the 90s. With Nora Ephron at the head, and I believe she and Wolitzer became friends afterwards. And I was watching the trailer for it, and I don't know, I haven't seen the movie itself, but the trailer really does look like it took sort of the most shallow concept of the book and made it into a movie. And, the book is about this woman. She's obese, and she recently came out of emotionally draining, a relationship where I think her husband was a bit of an ass. And she ultimately goes into comedy in the 60s, and she's this obese woman, and her comedy revolves around her poking fun and being self-deprecating about her own body. And I remember reading the jokes and thinking, man, you know, this doesn't jive well with me, this sort of, you know, body shaming stuff. And sure enough, as the decades went on, Dottie lost popularity because, you know, of women's lib movements in the 70s, and suddenly it's not cool anymore to, you know, bash on the fat girl, you know. And so it was interesting cultural changes because Dottie saw herself, you know, not as bashing herself, but as sort of taking ownership of who she is as a person. So I can see why people think she's the main character of the story, but I tend not to think that. I think her two daughters are. I mean, her daughters, Opal and Erica, they're teenagers in the 60s, and a lot of what they have to deal with is, you know, their mother isn't around because she really is very famous, so she's, you know, she's raising them in New York, but she's often in LA doing, like, you know, television stuff. And so they have to go around and everyone knows who their mother is, and then, you know, she's not in their day-to-day lives, and they have their own stuff going on. And I really do think that ultimately, even as teens, and then later as the story progresses in their young adults, their own lives take center stage. And Erica is also overweight, and she has really bad self-esteem, and she's in this go-nowhere relationship with this guy, Jordan, who doesn't even really like her, but is just kind of using her as somebody to have around, and he's a druggie, and both of them are just sort of going nowhere. And then Opal is popular, although, honestly, I don't think that was necessarily all that well depicted. And I'm kind of relieved, because the cover copy made it sound like, you know, she was Little Miss Perfect, but in the story, she actually has to take a semester off from school, albeit she's in Yale, but she's so distracted by her mother's, by that point, failing career that she's not going to classes or anything. So she's not necessarily Little Miss Perfect, and she also hasn't been able to, like, she hasn't gotten into any relationships with people. She seems a bit shy and uncertain about herself, and even about what she looks like, even though she's the pretty one. So I really thought there was some complexity there, and that the two of them and their journeys were sort of the major point of the novel. I mean, the two of them were the POV characters. And yet I think most people think of Dottie as the main character, and surely I think the movie has her as the main character. The movie seems to be mostly about asking the question of, is it okay for a woman to, a single mother, to have a career that sort of puts her children maybe in a secondary position to a certain degree, or at least in the public eye in a secondary position. It's certainly not conventional. And that's, I guess, an interesting question, and I love all of the Jewish overtones of the story. I mean, these characters are Jewish. But again, you know, it's about that, and one of the major things they take away is the obesity factor. And I really love what Wolitzer did with Erica and with Dottie and their characterizations. I mean, because, I mean, Erica in particular had really low self-esteem, especially as a teenager. It was pretty depressing, and I was worried that would go on. But actually, as an adult, I think she's able to take a little bit more ownership of herself, and she gets involved in another relationship, and she doesn't necessarily seem all that upset about her body all the time, and I just felt like there was some interesting, complex, layered reality to what she was saying about obese women. And I guess especially about Dottie, too, who ultimately has to confront the fact of her medical limitations, as it were, but this obesity has become such a big part of her identity that she doesn't really have that low self-esteem. It's become part of who she is. So I just feel like there's some interesting complexities in what Wolitzer is saying about obese women, to repeat myself and be redundant. But I do feel like the narrative was a little choppy, and I also felt that way with Hidden Pictures. And again, I just feel like there wasn't as much under the surface. I mean, more than with Hidden Pictures in this case, but not as much with Sleepwalking, or certainly not with her later works. There just wasn't that interior voice that I associate with Wolitzer. But one thing that does interest me is how she incorporated comedy into the story, and about how Dottie uses comedy in her life to sort of buffer up her life post-bad relationship, and it buffers up who she is as an obese woman. And later on in the interestings, I noted how Jules was the comedian of the group. That first she wanted to be a comedic actress, and then she sort of made her place in the group of the interestings by making the jokes. So Wolitzer, I think, says something about comedy where it's not just shtick. It's about how women use comedy to reinforce their lives and their identities. And in the case of This Is Your Life, it was obviously very focal and in your face because we're talking about this famous celebrity. But it was very interesting too. So I definitely recommend the novel. It's not my favorite of hers, but I can't get the feeling out of my head that if I watched the movie, it would feel reductive, and maybe I'd like the novel better. I'm sure the movie is a lot of fun, and glad that Nora Ephron did it. But it is also interesting to think about it in relationship with the trailers that I've seen to The Wife, which I'm hoping to see this weekend. Wolitzer's second adapted novel, at least in movie form, which is much more dramatic and I think has a serious tone, which might also say something about the differences between making a movie in the early 90s versus 2018. So that about covers it for me now. You can find the link to my my author backlist playlist down below, which at the moment only has 2 other Wolitzer backlists and this one. Next year, I think I'm going to do Emily St. John Mandel, because for a few years now I've been gushing about how much I love Station 11, and in fact I recently put it in my video of my top 10 favorite books ever. So I really owe it to Emily St. John Mandel to give the rest of her collection a try. So thank you all so much for watching, everyone. Happy reading, and I'll see you next time.